You know the scene. The gritty detective barks "enhance" at some tech guy, and suddenly a gray, pixelated smudge resolves into a crystal clear license plate.
Reflected in a victim's sunglasses from across the street.
Exactly. We all know it's a trope. We all know you can't just, create data where there isn't any. But according to the research we're looking at today, that's not strictly true.
It's not. Hollywood gets the user interface wrong. It's never that fast. But the math is actually crazier than the movies. It's a field of image processing called blind deconvolution.
Which sounds less like a cool spy tool and more like a medical condition you really don't want.
Yeah.
But the blind part is key here.
It's everything.
Because cleaning up a blurry photo is actually pretty standard stuff if you know why it's blurry.
Exactly. That's the distinction. If you know your hand shook exactly 2 millimeters to the left when you took the photo, you have the recipe for the blur. In the industry, that recipe is called the point spread function, or PSF.
The PSF, okay.
Right. And if you have the PSF, the recipe, you can just reverse it. It's basically algebra. You subtract the shake, and you get the clear image back.
But blind deconvolution implies we lost the recipe.
We lost the recipe, and we don't know what the original ingredients look like. You have the messy final image, but you don't know the original, and you don't know what kind of blur ruined it.
So you're solving for two unknowns at the same time.
Simultaneously.
That feels mathematically illegal. It's like telling me the answer is 12 and then asking me which two numbers you multiplied to get there.
Right. It could be 3 and 4. It could be 2 and 6.
It could be 1 and 12.
That's the fundamental problem.
Yeah.
We are trying to guess the original image and the blur pattern at the same time without accidentally picking the wrong pair.
So how do we stop guessing? Or at least, how do we make the guesses more educated?
Yeah.
The sources mention a detective phase, priori blur identification.
It sounds like looking for fingerprints, because that's essentially what it is.
Okay.
Before we try to fix the image, we try to identify the weapon. We look at something called the power spectrum of the image.
Okay, let's pause on power spectrum, because that sounds a lot like Star Trek technobabble. How should we visualize that?
It does. But think of it like a graphic equalizer on an old stereo system. You know how bass notes look different from the hi-hats?
Sure, yeah. Low frequencies are big, wide bumps, and high frequencies are sharp spikes.
Exactly. Well, images have frequencies too. Broad, smooth shapes are the bass, sharp details like edges, they're the treble, and blurs. Blurs mess with that equalizer.
In a predictable way.
In a very predictable way. A motion blur like from a car speeding by it kills very specific frequencies. It leaves these distinct linear dead zones in the spectrum.
And what about, say, an out-of-focus lens?
That leaves circular ripples like rings. These are essentially the fingerprints left behind by the physics of the blur.
So you just find the dead zones, the sources call them zeros, and you know what caused the blur. Case closed, you solve the math.
In a perfect world, yes. But here's where reality comes crashing in. Real photos have noise.
Grain. Static.
All of it. And I assume noise doesn't just sit politely in the corner.
No, it's everywhere. In the spectrum, noise looks kind of like television snow. So if you have a low-quality security camera image, that snow fills in all those dead zones. The zeros completely disappear. So the detective walks onto the crime scene, but someone has already scrubbed away all the fingerprints.
Precisely. In low-signal environments, the zeros are just indistinguishable from the background noise. So the direct detective approach fails. The evidence is corrupted.
So if the detective work fails, if we can't identify the blur up front, we have to move to the heavy artillery, the big three methods.
The big three non-parametric methods, yeah. Since we can't find the blur directly, we have to start guessing. But, and this is crucial, we can't just guess randomly.
Or we'd be here forever.
Exactly. So we need rules.
These are the constraints mentioned in the source material. Things like positivity and finite support.
Right. These are just common sense logic checks. First, positivity. In a digital image, pixel values represent light intensity. You cannot have negative light.
So if the math says a pixel has a value of, -5, it's wrong.
You throw it out. It's physically impossible.
Okay. And finite support. That one sounded a bit more abstract.
It just means painting inside the lines.
Oh.
We assume the object we care about, say a planet against dark space or a license plate on a bumper, has edges. It exists within a boundary.
So the background should be 0.
The background should be 0. If the algorithm starts putting bright pixels out in the background where nothing should be, we know it's hallucinating.
Okay, so we have guardrails. Let's look at the first method that uses them. The iterative blind deconvolution, also called the Ayers and Dainty algorithm.
This one is the speed demon of the bunch. It's a cyclical process. It just jumps back and forth between two worlds, the image domain and the Fourier domain.
I feel like we need to clarify Fourier domain again so we don't lose people.
Fair point. The image domain is just the picture as you see it, pixels, colors. The Fourier domain is that equalizer view we were talking about. It's all about frequencies and waves.
So why does switching back and forth help?
Because some rules are easier to enforce in one world than the other. So it applies the positivity rule in the image domain. Then it flips to the Fourier domain to enforce other spectral rules. It's like a rinse cycle, over and over.
The sources say the advantage is low complexity, it's fast. But there's a note here about stability, which is usually engineer speak for it crashes.
It's engineer speak for it lies to you. If your initial guess, your starting point, is too far off, the algorithm doesn't converge on a clear image. It diverges. It essentially makes things up and gives you garbage.
So it's fast but risky. A bad guess leads to a bad result. If I need something more robust, where do I go?
Then you move to method 2, conjugate gradient optimization. This is also known as Lane's method.
This one feels a bit more philosophical. It introduces the idea of a cost function.
Think of the cost function. It's usually labeled dealers as a scoreboard. But instead of points, it counts errors. It scores how wrong our current guess is.
So the goal is to get that score as close to 0 as possible.
Exactly. The whole point of the algorithm is to adjust the pixel values to make that score as small as possible.
The analogy in the notes that really helped me was the landscape. Imagine you're in a huge mountain range, totally dark, full of hills and valleys.
Yes, that's the parameter space. And the altitude at any point represents the error. So you want to be at sea level 0 error. That spot is the global minimum, which corresponds to the true restored image.
And the algorithm is like a hiker trying to walk downhill?
Precisely. It feels the slope of the ground right under its feet. That's the gradient. And it takes a step down. It just keeps walking downhill until it can't go any lower.
But wait, I see a logical flaw there. If I'm in a mountain range and I just walk downhill, I might just end up in a small valley, not sea level.
Yeah, you've just identified the local minima trap.
I'd get stuck in a little dip halfway up the mountain.
And because this mathematical landscape is multimodal, meaning it has lots of random peaks and valleys, the algorithm often walks into the wrong valley and just stops.
It thinks it found the solution because every direction from there is uphill, but it's actually nowhere near the real answer.
Exactly. The image it gives you might look sharper, but it's not the true image. It's a mathematical dead end.
So we need a way to get out of that hole. Which brings us to method 3, simulated annealing.
This is based on McCallum's method, and it fixes the local minimum problem by doing something that sounds completely counterintuitive.
What's that?
It introduces randomness.
It flips a coin.
Sort of. Like the previous method, it tries to move downhill to reduce the cost. But every once in a while, based on a probability variable $, it decides to move uphill.
It makes the solution worse on purpose.
Temporarily.
Why on earth would it do that?
To shake things up. Imagine you have a box of marbles and you want them to settle into the deepest possible holes. If you just gently tilt the box, they all get stuck in the shallow divots near the top. But if you shake the box,
the marbles bounce out of the shallow holes and have a chance to find the deeper ones.
Exactly. That shake is the uphill move. It allows the algorithm to scramble out of a local valley and explore other parts of the landscape to eventually find the true global minimum.
So it takes a step back to take 2 steps forward.
Precisely. And because of that, it is highly reliable. It is almost guaranteed to find the solution. Eventually.
Eventually being the key word there.
Correct. The price you pay for reliability is time. It is very, very slow. And the convergence speed depends on how carefully you reduce that probability over time. If you rush it, you get stuck again. If you're too cautious, you're waiting a week for your failure to process.
Okay, so we have the fast but risky one, iterative, the smart but trappable one, conjugate gradient, and the reliable but slow one, simulated annealing. That's the big 3.
Those are the non-parametric approaches, yeah. But there are engineers who look at this whole thing and say, I don't like guessing, I want a model.
This brings us to the alternative philosophies. And I have to be honest, reading the notes on ARMA and higher order statistics, the jargon level really spiked.
It can get dense for sure.
So let's break this down simply. What is ARM?
ARMA stands for Autoregressive Moving Average. It's a statistical model. So instead of treating the image like a grid of pixels to be shuffled around, it assumes the image itself follows a very specific mathematical flow.
It assumes the image is orderly or smooth.
Smooth is the perfect word. And that is its Achilles heel. These models are great at smooth transitions like a cloudy sky or a gradient background, but they really struggle with abrupt changes.
And in a photograph, an abrupt change is an edge.
Right, a dark suit against a white wall. When the ARMA model hits that sharp edge, it doesn't know how to handle the sudden mathematical jump. So it creates these ringing artifacts.
Like ripples in a pond.
Exactly like that. You get these weird ghost lines echoing out from any sharp edges. So while the math is very elegant, the result often looks unnatural to the human eye.
Then there's higher order statistics. The notes say this one has a superpower involving non-minimum phase PSFs, which is a mouthful.
It is. I'll simplify it. Most algorithms assume the blur is simple and behaves in a standard way. Higher order statistics can handle weird, complex, asymmetric blurs. But it has a massive constraint.
Okay.
It only works if the data is non-Gaussian.
Gaussian usually refers to the bell curve, right? Standard distribution.
Yep, in statistics, most random data clumps in the middle, that's the bell curve. This method fails if the data looks like that. It needs the data to be weird and lopsided to work.
So it's a specialized tool. It's like a wrench that only fits a very specific, very strange shape of bolt.
That's a great analogy. Powerful but niche.
Okay, let's pivot for a second. We've been talking about fixing a single blurred image. But in the age of smartphones, we rarely take just one picture. We take bursts. Does having 3 or 4 bad photos help us more than having one?
Immensely.
Yeah.
This is the domain of multi-channel blind deconvolution. This is the real heavy hitter of the industry right now.
So instead of 1 bad photo, I have 3 bad photos. How does that make 1 good photo?
Because they're all bad in different ways. Say you take a burst of 3 shots. In frame 1, your hand moves slightly left. In frame 2, it moved down. In frame 3, you rotate it a tiny bit.
So the zeros, those blind spots in the spectrum we talked about, are in different places for each photo.
Bingo. The algorithm looks at all 3 channels simultaneously. Where frame 1 is blind, frame 2 might see clearly. By cross-referencing all the data, the algorithm can triangulate the true image with incredible accuracy.
It cancels out the errors from each one.
It does. It uses something called a substrum-based algorithm to do these comparisons, and the perks are huge. You don't need to guess constraints. You don't need to worry about positivity or finite support nearly as much, and it is extremely robust to noise.
But there's always a but.
But it is computationally very expensive. It requires a lot of processing power, and obviously it requires rich data input. You can't do this with a single snapshot from an old security camera.
So we've run our algorithms, we've melted our processors. How do we know if we actually did a good job? We need to measure success.
We do, and there are 2 main acronyms you'll see in the lab, BSNR and ISNR.
Okay, BSNR is blurred signal-to-noise ratio. That just measures how messy the crime scene is to begin with, right?
Correct. It just describes the degradation level of the input image.
And ISNR is improvement in signal-to-noise ratio. This measures the performance of our restoration.
Right. It gives you a number saying this image is now 40% cleaner than what we started with.
I looked at the formula for ISNR in the notes. It's the sum of 5SNN YMSNM22.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with this.
That 5SNR is defined as the original true image.
Yep.
But if we have the original true image to put into the formula, why are we running an algorithm to restore it in the first place?
Welcome to the great paradox of image science.
That seems like a total cheat.
It's the simulation catch. ISNR is incredibly useful in a lab where you take a perfect picture, blur it on purpose, and then see if your algorithm can fix it. It proves the math works.
But in the field, in a real investigation with a real blurred photo,
It's useless.
completely useless.
Completely, because you don't have the answer key. You never actually know if you got the perfect restoration. You just know if it looks better.
That is wildly unsettling. It really reinforces that this isn't magic, it's just probability. We're making our best educated guess.
It keeps us humble. It reminds us that blind restoration is always an estimation.
So, bringing this all together, if I'm a user or an engineer designing a system, I have a menu of choices, a strategic selection matrix, if you will.
There really is a matrix of trade-offs. You can't have it all.
If I need speed, say I'm processing video frames in real time for a self-driving car, what am I picking?
You're picking the iterative method. It's fast. But you have to accept the risk that every once in a while it might just glitch out and diverge on you.
And if I need absolute reliability, if this is a crucial piece of evidence for a trial and I cannot afford a computer hallucination,
You go with simulated annealing. You accept that it might take hours or even longer, but you know it will climb out of those local traps and find the best possible solution.
and if I'm rich with data, if I have that burst of photos from my phone,
Multi-channel, hands down. It gives the highest quality result, assuming you have the computational budget to run it.
It's interesting. We started with the enhance button, which implies magic. It implies the information is just hiding there, waiting to be clicked. But what we found is really a negotiation.
That's a perfect word for it. Blind deconvolution turns an impossible mathematical problem into a solvable one, but only by leveraging constraints. We are constantly negotiating between how much computer power we have, how much time we have, and how much truth we need the image to contain.
It makes you think about the nature of seeing itself. We tend to think of a photograph as this perfect capture of reality. But once it's blurred, reality becomes a statistical probability.
And our ability to recover that reality is defined not by the lens, but by our willingness to accept those mathematical trade-offs.
The perfect image exists, buried somewhere under all the noise. You just have to be willing to pay the computational cost to find it. Thanks for listening to this deep dive into the math behind the magic.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.